Hello, good evening, and welcome to members of the Community Stakeholder Forum, and welcome to the wider viewing audience. I always do a quick introduction to these sessions, as we have some new members on the forum occasionally, and we also have new people watching at home. So the forum is part of an innovative approach adopted by Uttlesford District Council to engaging the whole community in conversations about shaping the future of the district through its local plan. At the heart of this approach is an open public consultation taking place over several months rather than the usual weeks. The plan itself has been broken down into smaller topics which can be more easily debated and commented upon. Every couple of weeks, this forum meets for a presentation on a particular topic. This forum is made up of people who represent different interest areas across the region, but it cannot represent every interest area or every group of residents. The forum debate that follows each presentation is designed to stimulate the public consultation, and it is important to note that the public consultation is the most important element of this process. It is really vital that all stakeholders contribute to the debate. Can I urge everyone to use their networks of contacts to share the forum presentations and to encourage participation and comment, especially try to involve members of the community who may not otherwise make their voices heard. If you go to the UDC website and search the new local plan, you will find various buttons that allow you to submit your views under each topic. At the end of the consultation period, Uttlesford District Council will consider all the representations received during the consultation and consider them when drafting the local plan. So to be clear, this group is independent of the council, is not a decision-making body, and its members' views will not override those contributed by the wider community. Participants have been asked to make contributions from the perspective of their special interest area rather than to advance any personal or professional agenda, such as in relation to their place of residence or the interests of a specific organisation. Now, turning to this evening's meeting, which is about creating new places and communities. If you are watching from home, you know what I mean by from home, we're obviously all at home. If you're not on the community forum, please note that you can submit questions throughout the evening on the Q&A function. There is a point in the discussion where we take 3 or 4 questions from the public, but we can only take 3 or 4. So if you see your question there, please do upvote it because it's the most popular questions that we tend to go to. So before I introduce our speakers, I'd just like to say that this evening's discussion is about the location and the approach and design of new houses across Uttlesford. I know that some people have strong views about whether there should be any new development in Uttlesford, but for the sake of this discussion, we are taking it as granted that there will be a large number of new houses coming into this area. So, for example, we had a presentation on the 15-minute city at the very start of this process. And the presentation we're having this evening is along the same lines, which is around where and how you can develop new houses. But it's a slightly different approach, which is about development in rural areas. So, I'm going to introduce the speakers for this presentation, who are Petra, Marko and Jennifer Ross from Velo City. Hello, and I'm going to hand over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I can't see Petra, but I'm sure she's here.
Hi, Jennifer. I am.
Hi. Brilliant. You're going to share your screen so we can begin. Good evening, everyone. As introduced, I'm Jennifer Ross, and that's Petra there. And we are one of 6 individuals who are promoting this, who have created this sort of initiative called, or we call it Velo City, velocity, but what it is, it's about regenerating and growing villages in a sustainable way. And as introduced, there is this idea of the 15-minute city, which is very relevant to the cities and Paris, which you probably all heard about, but you may not think it's particularly relevant to villages. So we're going to talk about this initiative that we developed in 2017. Okay, next slide, Petra. And why are we doing it? Rural areas make up 85% of the land, 18% of the population. There is housing pressure in the countryside, and there are over 100,000 villages in England. But planning policy to date has been very much about constraining villages, rightly so, because they're some of the most sort of precious parts of our countryside. But if you were to think about the future and, you know, how might we think about the village in the 21st century? Next slide. And why would we want to do that? And as you've probably all experienced in our rural areas, increasing congestions and all the sort of bad side effects of that on air quality and pollution, an aging population, you know, sort of house prices rising, people getting older with not facilities closing down in urban areas. And there's quite a lot of problems. There's a lot of good things about the sort of villages, but underneath there are these problems of aging, unhealthy living, car dependency, people being priced out, which you probably, many of you may have experienced as the supply becomes constrained and less building happens, prices rise. And increasingly, and you know, particularly as we've lived through COVID, and particularly amongst elderly, increasing social isolation. And that's something that we wanted to tackle. Now, to say that sort of villages are sort of constrained, there has been growth, and it's been incremental growth, and sort of unplanned growth. And we sort of felt that there is a much more positive and holistic way to look at villages and how they've grown, how they've grown historically, and how they might grow in the future. But that needs to be planned for rather than just letting little bits of development happen. And we wanted to take a much more sort of holistic view to how we grow our villages in the future. Next slide. So the initiative is by 6 people that all met on bicycles and talked a lot about how we wanted to plan. We're planners, architects, engineers, landscape architects, and general sort of public realm, and interested in sort of, you know, planning as a holistic activity. So this initiative came about, and we entered a competition in about 2017, the National Infrastructure Competition, run by the NIC, which was to look specifically at the Oxford-Cambridge corridor. And as you probably know, there's, you know, it's enormous pressure there. About 1 million new homes had to be accommodated there to 2050. And it was an idea of how can we do this in a sensitive and a sort of holistic way to look at how we could accommodate that growth. So we looked at that corridor, and we looked at the stations along there. And one of the things that struck us, we cycled all over it, was there were lots and lots of small villages, but connected close to stations. And we thought, well, actually, one of the things we're going to look at is clusters of villages, and at sort of growing them in a sort of incremental way. And this illustrates the proposition. And along there is the rail link at the middle with the station. But clusters of, you know, sort of up to about 10 villages around those stations, all connected by existing roads, and all within about 2 miles of each other. But traditional planning policy had sort of seen that none of those individual villages were sustainable in their own right. And what we said, well, what if you think of them as a cluster, and that they're a sort of symbiotic cluster that supports each other, and that they are, you know, kept you know, looked at in a holistic way. And underpinning the strategy is very much about seeing the station as the point where you connect to the wider area, but seeing the strategy very much as something that is switching from the car to movement by walking and by cycling, and taking the car, very much downgrading the car. So you only use the car for longer journeys, but when you're in the cluster, it's very much about walking, cycling safely. And so the strategy was very much about seeing that collection of villages and thinking about how that they could operate as a symbiotic cluster, working together. Next slide. And I'm going to hand over to Petra now to take you through some of the detail of how that strategy evolves.
So in the animation here, you can see Jennifer's point about the incremental growth and how these clusters would transform over time. And in between these villages, the green area that's growing that you can see is what we call the big back garden. And the idea is very much about having some productive landscape, such as allotments or orchards near the villages where people can have a degree of self-sufficiency in terms of local food production. Of course, there will still need to be deliveries from elsewhere, but we can increase the local production through having those allotments near the villages. But then also in perpetuity, protecting and enhancing the landscape and biodiversity and ecology of the landscape. So we all know that through climate emergency, actually, and through intensive farming practices, landscape has been downgraded, and we've seen wildflower meadows disappearing and bees, etc. in the UK. So this strategy is about enhancing the landscape and protecting it for the future generations. So that's the point to natural landscape. And the active landscape is the idea that this landscape also becomes a focal point for the village cluster, for the communities to come together, and each village cluster could have a different focus, could become an attraction from further, so people could come and visit specific village clusters for something that cluster is famous for, whether it's a focus on water or leisure or culture or food. And it is very much an idea about sharing economy and not having all services in each village, but having a cluster of villages where in each village you would have certain services. So you could have a medical facility in one village and you can have a school in another village. And by making those cycle and walking paths across the fields between the cluster, you will make it easier for children to get to school independently and to have less reliance on the car. And that idea of the sharing economy goes all the way to any of the new housing and the way that this can be developed. So in terms of scale, when we're talking about these clusters, and a 7-mile radius of this cluster of villages is what a child or an elderly person can comfortably cycle. So we're not talking about large distances. And just as a comparison, on the left-hand side, you can see the study cluster of villages that we looked at close to Winslow town centre station. And on the right-hand side is Richmond Park, just to give you a sense of the scale and the cyclability and walkability of these clusters, which we have, as Jennifer said, cycled ourselves and experienced. We've also talked to a number of people in the villages who also are running independent businesses and how they see them evolving. So historically, each village had evolved either around a manor or around the village green or around a farm. And our strategy is about retaining the special character of each village. We looked at the housing and building typologies in villages and taking clues from these as to what type of new development we might see as sustainable for the future growth. And the number 5 and 6 on the right-hand side is the kind of newer type of development, low density cul-de-sac or linear sprawl, which we felt is actually not really conducive to preserving that special character of the villages, and it creates more car dependency. It kind of sprawls the villages out and doesn't help. So we came up with an idea of this spatial plan and design code, which is very much about retaining the village core. So the green area that you can see is the existing village. The lines to the green are showing that actually we want to preserve certain views onto the green, but also preserving views to certain landmark buildings like the church or the manor. And then the pink are what we call housing fields, which quite often you can see in rural areas that there would be a new development far away from an existing village and town. It would need new roads and infrastructure built, and it would be completely disconnected from local from the local village and the existing services. So our spatial plan is about actually building tightly around that village core to a higher density, taking cues from the existing housing typologies that are already there. And then we looked at a different range of housing types that could be suitable in villages in preserving their character, and also live work typologies. I mean, it's interesting, just statistics just before COVID, 22% home workers were based in rural areas, and we certainly will see an increase post-COVID and during COVID of people working from home. So this gives us more flexibility to think about actually the quality of life that people want to have, and more people wanting to have access to open countryside and be based in more rural areas, which could make them more sustainable as there's more critical mass of people to reinvigorate some of the local services. So this image is showing what we call an imagined velocity village, where the gray are is the existing village core, and then on the top you can see the scale of the building. So when we are talking about higher density housing, we're actually not talking about you know, skyscrapers or something overpowering to the local vernacular. We are talking about housing that's actually always in tune with the existing and not overshadowing the local landmarks such as the church. And here are a couple of images that show the new housing in the context of the village on the right-hand side, and on the left-hand side, how this new housing might feel. One of these housing fields tightly clustered around the village core, where children can play safely, can move around, increasing social encounters, which again helps with loneliness and social isolation for elderly people. So since 2017, we have been, basically the competition was an ideas competition, which didn't lead to any direct commission for us, but we have been talking to various government bodies, and we have presented our vision to different forums. We have participated and been selected to take part in the Oslo Architecture Triennale, which was about the idea of how we look at growth in context of climate emergency. So in Oslo, we have launched our Velocity Manifesto and our principles that we have consolidated since winning the competition. We have also built partnerships with the people like Brompton, who are making the foldable bicycles and are very interested to expand into rural areas where they can see this opportunity of multimodal movement. So you can take the bicycle to the train station, then you can take your bicycle on the train, you get off in the town or city where you're going to, and then you continue your journey. So that makes it really convenient. We also won the William Sutton Prize for social housing and placemaking from Clarion Housing Group. And currently we are working for Blenheim Estate on a vision and strategy to implement the principles of velocity on their estate. And Jennifer will talk a little bit more about that. In terms of the housing and this idea of we could call it gentle density, and this is something that also the new National Design Guide mentions, and the government's commission, Building Better, Building Beautiful Commission, talks about the idea of gentle density. And when we look at existing villages, we have actually undertaken further research since winning the competition, thanks to the RIBA research funding, and went to, for instance, Dent in Cumbria, which is a historic village built at very high density, very compact, walkable. They have a grass-screed parking in front of the village, which actually blends in with the landscape. So there's lots of interesting lessons to be learned from some of these case studies. We also went to Poundbury in Dorset, that's quite low density, but there were some interesting urban design ideas to look at. And then again, very high density, also a bit prestige development in Sweden called Jakriborg. and more modern approaches in Cambridge with Marmalade Lane, and by Husen in Copenhagen, which is row housing at 100 dwellings per hectare. So I mentioned also Trinala in our manifesto, and in summary, just the principles that we have consolidated about velocity, and that me and Jennifer had talked through now. So first of all, we think it's about people over cars and creating those new movement networks, but using existing bridleways and pathways. So we don't need to actually have a huge capital spending to implement this strategy. It can be implemented very quickly at a very low cost. We're actually not saying that we're taking the car out of the equation completely. We are phasing the car out over time by giving people a more convenient way of making those short journeys on a daily basis. The second very important principle is about housing being compact, close or within and around the village core to prevent the sprawl that I showed earlier. And it's about the idea of the sharing economy, so connected, not isolated, having the clusters of villages to benefit everyone, and being able to reinvigorate some of the local services, but also bring in more potential for entrepreneurship and new work opportunities in rural areas, so that people are not simply living there and always commuting. So this is the idea of opportunity over decline. And last but important principle is about the ecology and biodiversity and protecting the landscape. So Jennifer will...
Yeah. So in summary, it's a sort of holistic approach to planning the future growth of groups of villages, and underpinning that, as well as all the design issues we talk about, the movement issues, the infrastructure planning. There is also a sort of detailed delivery strategy about how money raised from housing release gets recycled into the villages to help sustain them in the longer term. So it's rather than just sort of seeing bits of housing come forward, it's actually thinking of a sort of holistic way of planning the future of groups of villages. And as a result of the back of this, we're now working with Blenheim on, this is a very sort of unique opportunity in the sense that they own all the land around Blenheim, and they own sort of several villages, and they have very much embraced this sort of strategy that we've been talking about in relation to sort of 8 villages that surround Blenheim, and the potential of introducing new villages, all connected by cycle networks and walking networks, but also linking back to nearby stations. And very much some of the planning we've been looking at is very much looking different. They're their own developers, so we're looking very differently about how we plan for the future. And on the left is a very interesting sort of statistic that is about a typical housing development, typical suburban housing development. And then on the right is the Velocity principle. And we're very much about, you can see the big grey sort of allocation to roads and parking in a traditional village. And you can see in the Velocity way of a planning, it's taking that 40% down to 13%, and very much thinking differently about how you plan for the car, where you put the car, and very much giving space over to community courtyards, ecological greening, and the building footprint. So it's taking a much more holistic approach to planning and not putting the engineering and the car movement at the forefront, but very much thinking of the character of place. And that's been key to the work we've been doing. And also taking apart all the movements people make and planning for that actively, from the daily commute to the school run, to the weekly shop, to the commute, to the family weekend, to the kids' school bus, to sort of movement, how elderly people move and how kids move, and planning for every journey so that we can start to take out and plan proactively for all the movements. So the only reason for using the car are for longer journeys and less frequently, and very much linking things together and thinking about the place, very much in the sort of Holland model, and where you sort of actually actively plan for this, and you don't actually have to go on roads where cars are, and actively putting in cycle routes and walking. And so now we're sort of in the sort of process of, we think that the strategy is starting to get some traction, particularly in the COVID lockdown. We're seeing it as a sort of route that is very practical, low cost and incremental, something that can be done slowly. It does transform. It can be transformative, turning planning on its head, and rather than just saying villages are not sustainable, but actually thinking proactively about how we plan for the growth of villages in the future, that can have a real and positive impact on people's lives. And we think it is replicable across our country, and we sort of think that that it is something that we would that we should get hold of in the future planning, and really sort of proactively plan for our rural areas, and sort of, rather than sort of constraining it totally, do something where we actually think about holistically about how our rural areas want to grow in the future. And that's it. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Jennifer and Petra. Incredibly interesting presentation. Petra, would you mind stopping screen sharing now? We'll go back to the gallery, and then we'll go around the forum and see what people have to say. Firstly, I'm going to start with a guest member of the forum, David Burbeck. David, I have your credentials here, but if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself, that would be great. Thank you.
Evening. I work for a little social enterprise called Design for Homes. I have done for about 25 years. And we look at making housing work. I'm not an architect. I studied law originally. So I approach this very much from what works for people and how does it work. We've created a series of tools to support that. One of them is called Building for a Healthy Life, which I think Uttlesford may show some interest in the next couple of months. And I also run the government's Housing Design Awards. I was a board member at the Homes and Communities Agency, and have been involved generally in a lot of initiatives in the last 25 years. What I would say, I mean, just watching this and listening to this, it's a very strong idea, but it's not a new idea, which I think is really comforting, to know that we're visiting alternative proposals to the Sustainable Communities Plan. Back in 2003, John Prescott identified the M11 corridor, a growth area in the southeast of England, along with Ashford, and said that places like us would dwarf since. And other people came forward at the time, including people I was working with, saying, well, why don't we look at swelling the sizes of some of the villages in creating a more interconnected, sustainable community of existing communities, rather than trying to parachute in new towns? And a lot of that work was done by an architect called Peter Phippen of Phippen, Randall and Parks. And because it didn't fit with the political agenda at the time, it was ignored. So it's really good to see Jennifer and Petra revisit this, because frankly, I was very disappointed the first time around when it was just shunned. I think the villages do offer a lot of opportunity. I think the problem we have is that the network of roads is terrifying. If something like this is going to work, we have to take a completely different attitude to the country lanes that connect all these villages. Currently, you take your life in your hands if you set off on a bicycle. Sunday morning is possibly about the only time in the week when it is safe. The rest of the time, you've got some very big lorries, you've got a lot of people that drive like delinquents, and there seems to be an entire culture really of, in particular, I think about young males under the age of 40. Can you take a village road, a corner at about 75 miles an hour on two wheels? If you can, you're a man, So who wants to be a cyclist in that kind of environment? So I think one of the things that has to be tackled is how you would create a different environment for cyclists, because there are about a third of us who will get on a bike and then will cycle and they will take those risks. But the other 2/3 that this needs to work for currently won't. So something has to be done around the structure of the roads and how they work in order to make anything like this really stick. And it's like always, it comes back to transport. We're about to enter an era, I think, where a lot of people will wake up in the morning, 6 o'clock, get in a car, go back to sleep, or eat their breakfast in their car as they get driven to their homes, into their workplaces in places like Canary Wharf from this area. Because automated cars will do that for you. The suggestion is that significantly large numbers of people will move to this area and commute back into the well-paid jobs in the City of London, because they won't be doing the driving themselves. And they will also be moving in cars that potentially have the ability to go at 200 miles an hour. So we have to do something about the country lanes if we're really talking about getting people to cycle between them in order to create linked communities like this.
Us to respond to that, or because that is a, yeah.
And then we'll go to other.
Yeah. So yes, you do. I mean, that's an integral part of the strategy, and that's where it's lead from. You know, the underpinning all of this is the first move of taking how you reorganize cars, how you reorganize deliveries, how you reorganize movement networks, using the big back garden, taking out certain roads, blocking off certain roads. So it is quite a holistic strategy in that sort of sense. So we saw that as absolutely the first step. So it is putting the bicycle first, and it's how you plan, where you move vehicles through villages. So it is a holistic plan of groups, villages that actually do that, so that putting safety and allowing that movement to happen. Cars have to, we do make it inconvenient to connect between the villages with cars. You have to go out onto the other roads and move around. So that strategy, but it happens over time. It doesn't happen from day one. It happens as an incremental building till people get used to the fact that, when do I really need to use my car? So that is step one, because you're absolutely right, David. That is been the problem, why it falls over. And that's been an integral part of our strategy.
Thanks, Jennifer. We'll go through a few of the community forum members and their thoughts now. Please do, as we always do, community members, please raise your hand if you would like to speak, either literally or virtually. And we'll come back to Petra and Jennifer, and David will give you another chance to speak as well if we have time. Who would like to go first? You're being very shy this evening. Colin, should we start with you and then Janet?
Hi, I suspect that Janet and I are going to be picking up more or less the same point, because the point evolves around the economics of what we're going to be doing over the next 15 years, rather than the practicality of young mad drivers and all sorts of other things. I do actually think our focus, particularly for the local plan at the moment, is in the wrong place. After we had the meeting on the economics and other things, I did a bit more research because of the reaction I got, and I found that none of the local economic partnerships actually describe much about what the general business development is going to be in this area, and the North Essex partnership actually describes us as an outward-looking organisation, which means that even with our current population, the majority of the population drive out of the area for their work. And if we're going to be increasing the number of houses by, say, 100% over the next 10 to 15 years, unless we've got vast inward investment and the creation of new jobs, what we're doing is doubling or tripling the number of people who'll be driving out of the area to find their work, which means that linking things together by bike paths is undeliverable. And a lot of these, the things we've just been presented, I think they're lovely, but I just don't see how they can be delivered. And people will look to the developers to actually do or provide most of this work, but we haven't actually got an infrastructure strategy in place, nor a community infrastructure levy that will enable the investment that's needed to do this. So my concern is that much as the ideas are brilliant, I like them, but I think they're completely undeliverable unless we do something about the fact that there is a lack of employment in our area, and that all we're going to do is overload our infrastructure unless we do some sort of intervention. And I think it's got to be government or local authority led, which means that the number of journeys out of the area are reduced, and that the number of people who are then living and working in the area can support the sort of infrastructure changes that have been talked about.
Thanks very much, Colin. Janet, I'll hop over to you to see if you had anything to add to that.
My first thing is an extension to what David is saying, is these sort of plans in relation to the night and the day and lighting, and how this, if you like, how the services connect, and also through the seasons. Anyone who's walked the paths around here in the last few months, you know, the tracks are there to link the villages, but they're mud. So it's more about how that happens. And going back to what Colin has said, you know, where are the business spaces? Your diagram showed the shared barn workspace, and we've discussed that sort of setup in previous meetings. But, you know, farm buildings, some of those have been converted to business spaces, but it's just where the travel to work lines are, and just a bit more detail on that. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Janet. Jennifer or Petra, do you want to come back on that?
Petra, you go. Do you want to go?
I have a couple of points, and Jennifer can continue to add hers. I mean, in terms of this being incremental, it also creates job opportunities, because if you are building 500 homes on one side somewhere with new infrastructure, you're looking at big house builders. But if you are building, you know, 20, 30, 50 homes around a village, then you could tap into smaller contractors, more locally based contractors. So that was one point about, I mean, it doesn't completely answer Colin's question about employment, but I think it's an important point to make. And then in terms of the commuting, I think that the element of linking to rail is important, because we're not talking about people cycling to work necessarily, but cycling to the station to get to work. And we know that let's say in Netherlands, this is very well established, and it has taken some time to establish that, but it's about making that convenient, and people working on their laptops on the train is actually much more convenient than sitting in a car driving, because you can't really work. I mean, yes, if you're sitting in that autonomous vehicle, you can also work on your laptop, but the autonomous vehicles are not quite here yet. They will eventually come, but I think that now is the opportunity, because there's also a lot of statistics about the pollution that autonomous vehicles cause in terms of the brakes and the exhausts and so on. So it's not really taking the air pollution issue out of the equation, and with the move to zero carbon in 2050. So those were the 2 points, and there's it's not answering everything, but Jennifer might have more.
I think the really interesting thing we found out, particularly when we did Blenheim, was how many movements were commuters and how many movements were all the other movements that were actually in the network. The movements by commuting are often very direct and to the station, and or to Oxford or to the West. And so there was sort of longer distance connections to those through, as part of a strategy, through a bus strategy, through a rail strategy, through other strategies. But the big movements and the big commuting movements were the cross movements to schools, to short distance shopping. It's taking all of the movements. And so, it's sort of like there is the commuting movements, but those are actually quite easy to deal with. But it's actually, and the one movement was particularly the mother who goes and drops her child to the school, that then goes somewhere else and then goes somewhere else. It's all those short movements. So our strategy is particularly about the last 5 miles in a journey, and trying to sort of cluster these villages and then taking you to the station and allowing that to then take you to the commuting route. So it's quite reliant on stations, our strategy, or linking to park and rides. So we're sort of trying to take out all the local movements that are actually quite polluting movements. So that's part of our story.
I do just want to get in some more of the forum members, and I know that David wants to come back to. If you don't mind, David, I'm just going to go to a few forum members first, and then we'll come back and give David another chance to speak. Edward, and then Alison. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we need to ask some fundamental questions before we start building anything, which is, why do we want to build it, and why would people want to live there? And if you kind of think back historically to kind of where new towns have been built, like Saltaire or Port Sunlight or Bourneville, there was a fundamental reason, a huge economic reason for building them. and they had a purpose. And even if Letchworth Garden City, whatever, had a purpose, which was commuting. And so it was built on a jolly good train line so that it would serve the commuters. So I think we need to start with a notion of why. Maybe you want to build a community where it's ethical living, or it is a sustainable flagship, or there is a science park, or it is a velocity, or there is a forest. It is encapsulated within a forest, which has got potential for us. But we need to think of why. The other thing is what we are lacking fundamentally is a decent east-west train line. So we got our north-south train line, and actually the villages up and down there are absolutely saturated, with the exception of Wendon Zambo, which hasn't been touched at all, despite having a railway line right through it. But in the pieces that we were given as our homework, there is a rapid busway or something. There was a rapid bus transit coming out of the airport and running through to Dunmow and Braintree and on to Colchester. Well, it shouldn't be a bus. It needs to be a train. And if this model we've just been looking at today has anything to go for it, it's about you've got to have a train. So you need to reverse Beeching and get a train line that runs east-west, coming out of the concrete wall at the end of the train station underneath Stansted Airport, and taking us through the little eastern area, and then joining up with the Flitchway and turning the Flitchway back into a railway line. So that seems to be fundamental, that you've got to establish that sustainable transport infrastructure. Then you can start thinking about, okay, now do we want a garden community there, or these wonderful little velo villages around that? But otherwise, the little transport thing that we were given for our homework is totally inadequate from a cycling point of view, inadequate from a rail point of view, and it doesn't even have the Flitchway managing to cross the M11. So that doesn't even get to anywhere. It just peters out and stops in the middle of nowhere. So I think we've got to get those fundamental things right, the whys and then the transport. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Edward. Back to transport again. Every week, no matter what the subject. Alison.
Same as Edward, really. I was just going to mention about the rail connections. So that was all. I mean, a lot of services are based in Chelmsford, so it's a real issue for people in West Essex already. So this wouldn't improve that matter at all, would it?
No.
Same point.
Thanks. Yes, and then I've got Richard next on my list. Thank you.
Hopefully it's unmuted me. Yes, I mean, just looking at the presentation, I mean, it is fascinating, but I think it presupposes that you have actually got a perfectly formed network of villages to accommodate what is being proposed. And I don't think we in Uttlesford have that. I mean, even actually looking at your Blenheim, I mean, I do know the Blenheim Estate a bit, and I mean, to get from Wootton in the north down to North Oxford, I don't think many people are going to be using a bicycle, and yet that is where they're probably going to want to go. But just in terms of Uttlesford, I mean, there is so much space between the villages, and there isn't very much on offer in an awful lot of the villages. I just don't see how you could form clusters. I mean, the only scope for clusters with the transport communications is on the west of the district. I mean, there is nothing of significance on the east of the district. And so, I mean, it is pushing everything again towards the transport links that we have, and that is the corridor, the M11 corridor, and the railway corridor. So, I mean, whilst the presentation was fascinating, I think it does presuppose that you have actually got a perfectly formed framework within which to operate.
Thanks very much, Richard. I'm going to come to Samantha and then come back to David, if that's okay. And then I see Frank and Anthony have their hands up. So, and then we'll hear from Petra and Jennifer again. So Samantha, thank you.
Yes, thank you. I wondered about walking to school. It could take ages if we have to walk from one village to another where we are currently. Cycling could be slightly more viable, but we would need the good cycling paths that allow us to be safe. Some of our roads are really very narrow. I agreed with what other people have said about rail. We need to electrify the whole of our British railway systems. We need to use rail more for freight as well, and also make rail affordable, because I think we're going to find that it's key workers who have to do the essential jobs that do need to get around and get transport. Currently, rail isn't really very affordable for people, I don't think. It's run on a really for-profit basis, which doesn't suit all of us. I wondered about what people do in the City of London. So they have skywalks there, and they're raised walkways, which were to alleviate the people walking around at ground level. So I wondered if something like that would be viable to make it easier to walk. But I can't imagine. I think that would ruin the look of villages. It works in the City of London, but not so great for here. So commuting, I think that's really important. Firms should allow people to commute only when that's essential, and we should be allowed to work at home where our work can be done from home. Some people don't let people do that. So I've noticed finance firms in the City of London are insisting on people that they want them all back in the office, even though there isn't really a need for that desk job to be done from the office. So I think people will have to have updated employment policies which allow home working as a standard where that's possible. As for the Oxford and Cambridge corridor, I looked into commuting, but between Cambridge and Oxford, and it was really difficult. So I don't think we've got proper rail links there. So we do need a better developed railway system, as other people have said. I also wonder about automation of jobs in the future. So we're envisaging these crowds of people commuting from our villages back into London. But if we have automation of jobs, which could be a real thing in the next few decades, I wonder what sort of work we will be doing and whether there are going to be jobs for anyone. And if not, then what we need to actually be doing and how we might have to have more leisure time and more allowing for a different way of living than we're actually imagining. It might not be exactly what we think it will be today. It might be a completely different vision of the future in terms of how we occupy ourselves and our lifestyles as well. And I wondered also about the social housing that you mentioned. I think Petra was mentioning that, about how you've won an award for that from, I think you said, Clarion Housing Group gave you that award. In Uttlesford, we now know that 60% of our residents earn below 34,000 per year, 40% earn below £25,000 per year, and this makes housing unaffordable. So with these social housing projects, I wondered how you're going to fit that in our villages, what that will look like, because we absolutely need social housing here for our younger people and for people that don't earn that much, but who also provide our key services here, just like they do everywhere else. And what style of housing will that be? And where exactly will we put it? Are really interesting questions, which I didn't quite see from your presentation and would like to know more. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thank you, Samantha. David? Thank you for being patient.
I was just going to respond with a couple of points, facts, really, I suppose, to some of the questions and comments made. The first one I thought was really interesting about where will the jobs be. One of the schemes referenced in the work presented by Petra was that Poundbury was one of the 5 projects that she analysed. Poundbury's got something like 2,100 homes now, 2,100 homes, and it's got more. It's the only new build scheme in Britain that's got more jobs than homes. And when you go and look at it, you spot there's a hotel, there's a chocolate factory famously, there's a cereal factory that recently closed, and there's a Waitrose. And you think, okay, well, that's where all the jobs are. The jobs aren't in the big commercial sheds. There are 1,800 of the 2,200 jobs are in people's houses. And Poundbury is a really interesting model because it's the only place where people keep data on this. There's no advantage to somebody like Barratt's or Taylor Wimpey finding about what goes on in the homes that they sold 5 years ago. So they don't keep a record on it. So we don't really know what goes on with most building. But with the Duchy of Cornwall being so interested in things like social patterns and what's happening in Britain generally, they keep data on this. So it's literally the only place you can look at and find out where the jobs are. 1,800 homes, 2,100 homes with 1,800 jobs in them. And one of them, I believe, is the world's largest second-hand wedding dress retailer. So it's essentially a lady who runs a business from home. There are like 6 people she employs in her living room, and they recycle everybody's wedding dresses and sell them all over the world. So you're getting a completely different pattern of employment. And I think people sort of assume that what we need in Uttlesford is a factory making, say, Airbuses or something like that in order to stimulate employment. But what you actually want is a decent internet connection, which Gigaclear are beginning to, put in the villages like Cutler's Green, where I live. 2 years ago in Cutler's Green, I think there was about 5 people working from home, and there's 27 houses here now. There's 27 houses where people are working from home. So something is changing. I think it's really dramatic. I think it might stick as well. 2 other things though. The business about whether it's really possible to connect these villages and could you do it? Jersey is an example at the moment where Phil Jones, who I work with quite a lot, is essentially taken all the village and connected them using a cycle network. And the way they've done that is to reduce the speeds in the little lanes between the little villages in Jersey down to 15 miles an hour. And it's beginning to take off. People are beginning to think, right, I'll leave the car behind because I can face the idea of going into a shared surface with somebody else in a car at 15 miles an hour. It's a smaller place than Uttlesford. I think it's about a quarter of the land mass. But it does show that these things are beginning to take off. And I just want to remind everybody, in particular the portfolio members, the biggest grant at the moment on the table that's not been taken up is the gear change grant, which Grant Shapps, unusual name for somebody handing out grants, but essentially he proposed £2.5 billion for cycle networks in August of last year. From what I hear from Department of Transport people, there's very little of that money's been applied for at the moment. So, if you really were going to try this and see if it worked between, say, 6 villages, like, say you connected to Thaxted, to Cutler's Green, to Debden Green, maybe even all the way through to Newport, at the moment, there's probably about 1.8 billion waiting for somebody to put their hand up. So can we be trialing this as an idea?
Right, get on to that, Luke. Thanks very much, David. I'm going to come to Frank and Anthony and then ask Jennifer and Petra if they want to respond. And I think then Eleanor wanted to add something. So Frank?
Yes, please. Yeah, very quickly. Yes, interesting presentation. I do feel it was rather idealistic, although I appreciate that they have managed to implement, I think, or trying to implement these schemes in some places. I'm not sure it fits the geography of our region, as many other people have explained. Trains, as you know, we don't really have any that actually do very much for us, except north-south. But I think something that would be quite interesting is to have the movement analysis that I think Jennifer was talking about, to have that done on a demonstration area within Uttlesford to understand better and get that data that David was just talking about, for instance, about Poundbury. Why not get some more data in this area? That would be helpful. That would inform some of our decisions. It may help to show that perhaps this Velocity idea really doesn't work here, or alternatively, perhaps there are some areas where it might. So yeah, interesting presentation though. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Does anyone from UDC want to just comment on whether they are collecting that kind of data?
Stephen, I'm looking to you. I think the answer is we're going to collect a heck of a lot of data, including on transport movements. So yeah, very good point, Frank. But yeah, Stephen, I don't know if there's anything.
Yeah, no, that's probably as good as answer as I can do, Luke. I mean, we are in the process of starting to commission transport evidence to inform the local plan. In doing so, we can look at the suggestions which we have heard tonight and which we received through the consultation.
Thanks very much. And just a reminder to everyone to keep adding your questions to the Q&A and upvoting any questions you see there that look very similar to the one you want to ask. Sorry, everyone keeps moving around on the screen. I think it was Anthony next.
Thank you. Funny enough, first word I've written down is Poundbury. Simply because, one, I know it well. A friend of mine I've known all my life is living there, and I've seen it pretty well from the start. Just as my grandfather lived in Harlow, and I saw that from the start. But the point being that this was immediately what I thought of when the presentation was being made. Poundbury seemed to be the ideal situation, albeit low density, but on the other hand, I think the density is increasing quite considerably. Secondly, the question of the extent to which one can move out of where one is into other areas, into rural areas. Well, of course, one can't do that around Saffron Walden under the present situation. All the end estates have practically got a tight noose around it, and I doubt very much that we'll get very much joy out of them in trying to do anything with regard to the area that they have any interest in. The question of ring road, of course, is a lovely one, but as you rightly pointed out, someone's got to pay for it. And if they're going to put a ring road in a cluster of villages, well, how about one in Saffron Walden for a start? So one gets to a situation of what one does with regard to transport. Now, the interesting thing is that the Cambridge mayor has come up with this proposition, which seems to be going places and having some form of urban of movement between villages on the old railways. And that, of course, doesn't necessarily affect us, but Kevin Bentley, who was at the time Vice Chairman of Essex County Council, I don't think he is now, but that doesn't matter. His proposition was about a couple of years ago was that there should be the similar sort of link from Colchester to the airport and then north to link into the Cambridge scheme. Now, whether or not that gets anywhere, of course, is another matter, but it does take into a point that was raised by Edward. It would certainly make a lot of difference in that respect. But here we are, as is rightly pointed out, with a railway line that runs down west of the district, a road which runs parallel to it, and another one which runs down the south, along the south of the district, east to west. It really doesn't show that there is any great ability to do very much in respect of the rest of it. This is the largest district in Essex, and is the largest district in the whole of the home counties cluster around London. It is also the least occupied. Less people live in it per whatever you want, per square mile, per hectare, than anywhere else. That's absolute fact at the present moment. Now, how one gets things to move, I do not know. I've looked at the documents that we've had, and again, it seems to show that the only way in which one is capable of developing is along the railway line in some shape or form. Everyone seems to agree to that, unless somebody can come up with another proposition. I think that has to be right. And I analysed this in my response to one of the first of the seminars in my response. Now, interestingly, the London Stansted Cambridge Consortium, which otherwise calls itself the Innovation Corridor, has come up with a new a separate scheme which it considers to be the core of the consortium, which effectively is the Hertfordshire and Essex area, which Uttersford, of course, is part. And it's come up with a prospectus, if that's the right description, for what it does. And it starts off with a section on life sciences and healthcare. So that's what people look at to start with. And where's the first place that they suggest they should consider Chesterford Research Park. Now, that's right, of course. In fact, it comes in their prospectus before Public Health England, which is going to go to Harlow. But if
Anthony,
I'll take this out in about half a minute. So.
Anthony, so can I just give you 30 seconds more, because I'm just aware we've got a few more people to speak.
Okay, half a minute, Angela.
Thank you.
I simply want to say that if Chesterford Research Park is the place which is promoted in this respect, then you're going to get so many Class A's and B's wanting to live in and around there. Where are you going to put them? Start at classically Great Chesterford and start going south from there. That's it. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Anthony. I just wanted to slip Eleanor in quickly before we go back to Petra and Jennifer, if that's okay, because I think that she might follow on quite nicely from Anthony's last point.
Thank you. I think, yeah, just to expand maybe on what some people have already said. So mainly that it seems like a very exciting plan and that it's quite idealistic, I suppose. And maybe, yeah, so the first point maybe was that it all sounds quite expensive and we kind of need to balance the affordability with the sustainability. So I thought the way that, I suppose it's just idealistic. So I think the sustainability is great, and I wondered if maybe the transport was not very realistic. So I thought perhaps rather than expecting kids to cycle to school, maybe the shuttle buses or things like that would make more sense. So overall, I think maybe it's looking long term in the way that it's going to take a while to enact the plan, and it's going to take, so it's long term in that way. But then I think our long term goals are probably to avoid using the car more. And I think, as we said, it doesn't really prevent the commute, because it's just linking the villages rather than that. So maybe it's not long term enough, but will take too long, if that makes sense.
Do you think there would be resistance, Eleanor, to people, let's say your age, teenagers who can go to school on their own cycling? Do you think there is resistance to that?
Well, I wonder so I go to County High, but obviously that's in town. So I think people who live in town probably walk. And I think people who live in the villages, probably the reason they don't do that is, as people mentioned, because of the safety. So yeah, maybe if it was better linked, then I think that would help a lot.
Yes, and no one's mentioned walking, but of course trying to walk between villages is even more hair-raising. I tried that the other day. I won't be doing it again. It's interesting, actually, to me, that there's so much talk about transport, but Petra and Jennifer, not a lot of people have picked up on the homes or the buildings actually in the villages, which suggests to me that there isn't resistance to the idea of the kind of housing that you were proposing around the village. It was just the reality of the transport. I don't know if that's true or not, but Petra and Jennifer, I'll let you have a reaction to all you've heard. And if anyone else wants to add anything, please stick your hand up in the meantime.
Okay.
Go on.
Can I go, Jennifer?
Yeah.
I wanted to get back to Samantha's point about social housing and key workers, and just to reiterate, so the idea or the strategy is that the housing that we're proposing in our vision is smaller housing. So currently we see this sprawling housing, which are large houses, bungalows, expensive with double garages, etc., with big gardens. What we are talking about is more compact and higher density, and therefore more affordable. And if people don't have to, if we get the critical mass and can start to have some of the local services, then having the key workers or the people who are actually working in those services being able to live in the local area, then that all starts to come together in a more sustainable way. On David's point about Pambury, I think that's a great point about the workspaces, and what was really interesting lesson from Pambury was that obviously in towns there's the high streets concept, and and the high street shops, which are all clustered together in one linear arrangement usually, and you would get the chains. And in Pambury, there's this inbuilt and very planned idea of the 30 or 35 square meter commercial workshop spaces, which are dispersed across Pambury. And as David mentioned, you know, these spaces are actually home to many new independent businesses that people are running. And I think it's important to think about in rural areas about the fact that, you know, the startups, or when we talk about startups or you know, accelerators and businesses, we imagine something very high tech, but it could be cottage industry, and it could be different things. I mean, lots of women in rural areas, particularly if they are on maternity leave, have opportunities to start their own businesses if they have good digital connectivity, because they could do lots of work just, you know, with the phone and or a computer, and be independent. So I think there's an element of that in the picture about where is the work going to be and what kind of work is it going to be. And I think that we'll definitely see that Samantha, you mentioned the worry about people being basically forced back into the offices, but in a way I feel much more optimistic about the flexibility that has emerged through COVID, and that the employees will actually demand this flexibility to continue, because there's lots of studies also showing that people are much more productive, those who actually want and enjoy working from home. Not everyone enjoys that. Some people want to go into the office, but actually it's more economically viable for the companies and businesses too, because then they don't have to have large offices if not everyone's coming into the office on a daily basis. So I think we'll see a lot more of that happening, which again supports this idea of clustering of villages and having local services being able to house more people who work in those local services locally and more affordably. And to Eleanor's point about this seeming expensive, actually it is cheaper in terms of the infrastructure. It is definitely cheaper because we're not building new big roads. We're using the existing right-of-ways and pathways. We are putting in, so let's say if in a city you're putting in high-speed data cabling, you'd have to take out the tarmac and do lots of construction work to lay in the cabling and to connect homes to internet. But in rural areas, you can use these right-of-ways, and you can do, you know, you can do that very, very cheaply, the digital connectivity part. Then of course we will need to upgrade some of the paths in terms of lighting and safety, and the point about day and night is something that we definitely have been thinking about. In terms of, there were some points about weather and seasons. Now, I mean, I think it's much more about sort of a mind shift, and once people get the sense of the freedom that it gives them. I mean, you know, if you don't have to ferry your children around to every out of school activity or to see their friends, if they can do that independently, that gives you as parents more flexibility around your time and your work. And we know that, you know, in countries like in Denmark, in Copenhagen, they have snow in the winter for a couple of months. And I think they have this saying about, you know, there's nothing, there's no things such as bad weather, it's only bad clothes, or, you know, insufficient clothes. So I think it's obviously it's a thing that is very much that they're used to it by now, and it's a learning curve, or, you know, there needs to be early adopters of this idea and strategy here. But over time, I think in the long run, it is sustainable, and therefore it is cheaper, because if we are creating more damage and more carbon footprint by building maybe, you know, something now which is going to have to be refolded in 30 years time, it's actually not sustainable.
Petra, thank you. I'd like to go over to John, who hasn't spoken yet, and if there is anyone else who hasn't spoken this evening who would like to say something, please stick your hand up now, because once we've had John and anyone else that wants to speak, I'll come back to David and Jennifer to finish off. John.
Apologies, Andrew. It took me a long time to think of how exactly I wanted to say this, because I think I love this presentation. I love the idea. But like so many of the other presentations we've had, we're still focusing on transport and the things we can plan. That's what the plan's about, I guess. But actually people are awkward. I used to live in Woodstock. I know the Blenheim Estate quite well. I think the only thing that binds those villages together is an underlying resentment with the landowner. Villagers have a real sense of identity. Binding them together in new groups is not going to be straightforward. So we have to somehow break down some of that identity at the same time that we're trying to build community capacity and identity with new people moving into an area. I think how we actually manage people in these settings so that people have a sense of the place where they live. I genuinely don't know how we do it, but I think that is a risk that runs through all these things we're talking about. Thanks, Angela.
Thanks very much, John. Is there anyone else that hasn't spoken that would like to add anything? No, I concur, John. I think that what we're talking about is quite a lot of culture change, not just new roads and houses, but Samantha, do you want to just make another point and I'll come to David and then finish with Jennifer?
Yes, thank you. I was interested in what you say about Poundbury. It does look lovely. I was looking on Rightmove. It is compact, but it's truly expensive. So I don't know how that works for us as the income limits that I've said. Not everyone is this person who's able to go and be an entrepreneur. There are people in our country who don't really leave with a decent education from their schools. We need a lot more investment in education if we are to be managing okay. And also our pension system. So I just wonder if that's going to work for everyone and just how social housing, because I can't see any in Poundbury. So and it concerns me. Thank you.
Thanks very much. John, did you want to add something? Did you put your hand back up? No. No, okay. Edward, if you're very brief, I can just squeeze you in before we go back to David and Jennifer.
Right, yeah, just very briefly, the presentation just points us in a direction which is so much more healthy than what we're doing to our villages at the moment. At the moment, we're just taking places like Elsenham and whacking in, squeezing in as many houses as we can possibly squeeze in because a developer wants to. And if wherever we're going to do something in a village, if we adopt these principles, whatever else we fail to do, that will be an improvement.
Thanks very much. So I'll come back to David and then let Jennifer finish. Thank you, David.
So 3 points on the provision of homes and the direction of travel. First, a response to the comment about Poundbury not having any social housing. It does have a very high percentage of social housing. I think it's 40%. And I think Cambridge and places like Poundbury, pretty much outside of London, are the highest allocations in the country. But don't get hung up on the idea of where does social housing come from, because the current government's not remotely interested in paying for it. And waiting for it is like going to be waiting for a bus in Nuttlesford on a Sunday. I think what you've got to look at is the alternative solutions for supply. The government's got a consultation paper that went through Parliament last year and I think is now at white paper status, which is called First Homes. And the plan really is to essentially reduce the cost of home ownership and broaden the base of home ownership by taking out the cost of land. And the first project of this type is being built at Northstowe and it's being driven by South Cambs. And I think obviously you've got excellent connections with them. I think it's really important you have a look at that, because the model they're proposing, where the local authority effectively becomes like a parish council, the owner of the homes that would have been built in the 1920s, and is then able to reallocate them to people with the greatest need who are local at a later point, but through a home ownership model, is a radical idea which I actually really support. I think it's effectively gives people what they want and also makes sure they look after where they live. But one final point though, I think, and this is a comment as much to Petra and the idea of Velocity, don't talk about swelling villages by 25 or 50 or 75 homes as though that's an incremental addition. a huge number of villages in Uttlesford don't have that many number of houses. You're talking about doubling them. You know, the village where I live has got 27. And the moment you head into that area where you're suggesting that you might add 25 or 50 or 75, you're bringing a gross development value that gets the radars ticking in all the land buying departments of all the major builders, because that's where they're interested. They can't make the economics of being a developer work when it's 4 or 5 or 6 units, but they certainly can when it's 25 or 50. So to get the small, locally oriented schemes off the ground, keep them small. You know, Uttlesford should be looking at the idea of trying to get little parcels of land just big enough for 2, 3 or 4 homes, and then trying to offer them through mutual home ownership societies. This is one big innovation that I had a little bit of involvement in this through my legal background, but mutual home ownership societies is a direct translation of what the Swedes have with what they call their right to live. You effectively have a quarter share in a development of, say, 4 homes. You can buy it, but you don't own it, and you can trade it, but you don't sell it. So it doesn't come with things like stamp duty. It doesn't come with many of the complications of leasehold. And it's a really excellent way for you to, to effectively provide a house at, say, £180,000 sales price rather than 250. And I think it's something that's really worth investigating. I'm working on some of the biggest projects in the country. In fact, 7 of the biggest 8 in the country at the moment.
Just 20 seconds, sorry, just because I'm miles over time and I'm going to get...
Every one of these schemes, every one of these big developments has got a plan to allow people to buy in places like Barking and Dagenham, at low cost home ownership. And it's a far more robust model now, really, than waiting for social housing, which I think is on its last legs.
Thank you very much. Sorry that I've had to hurry a few people up this evening. I knew it would be one that lots of people wanted to comment on. Jennifer, would you like to round it off before we go on to public questions?
Yeah, so no, thanks very much, everyone. It's been fascinating conversation. I think David's thrown down a challenge. He's thrown down, can Uttlesford do something like this and have a test case? The money is available from chaps, as said, to try and invest in this and to do something really innovative. So I would put the challenge back to Uttlesford. Can you look at a group of villages? It's not the panacea, it's not the answer to everything. You're going to have, I know there's a lot of other pressures, but in as a rural district, is there a group of villages you could look at a VeloCity model and think about test casing it in your borough? That's it.
Thank you very much. Thanks, everyone. That was a really interesting discussion. Luke, I'm going to hand over to you. I can see there's quite a few questions. You could navigate us through that. That'd be great. Thank you.
Yes, we won't be able to get through all of them, but I'll pick out the few most popular. Conscious we're already over time, but yeah, thanks everyone. Really useful discussion. We were hopeful that the presentation would draw out a lot of these issues, and you've really done well in getting across the breadth of issues that it raises. And yes, the challenge has been laid down for us as to put together this draft plan. So yeah, thank you all for those thoughts. So getting on to the questions, the most popular is from Arabelle Hurlston, and it says, wouldn't VeloCity's project lead to the urbanisation of villages because of the additional requirement for hard surfaces for cycle lanes, connecting network, etc.? Also, isn't a bicycle-based transport system too weather and age dependent? Jennifer or Petra, I don't know if you want to tackle some. I mean, some of this has been, I think, covered it has been a wide-ranging discussion. But is there anything you want to say directly to that question?
I think it's something, it's part of it. We've talked a lot tonight about transport, and it's about an integrated transport, and it's providing choice. It's not the answer to everything. It's trying to say to people, putting in systems and networks that allows you the choice to walk, to cycle, to get things delivered, to work at home, and to give you a choice other than the car, that you don't have to jump in your car. And that's the point of this. It's just to think of integrated and overarching transport strategy that allows you to do that. The networks we've talked about are also about age-dependent. Electric bikes are coming force majeure, and you may have seen in Holland, you know, sort of a lot of older people getting on bikes and sort of causing a lot of problems in Holland about doing that. But, you know, the electric bike is coming, the electric buggy is coming, but it's just giving a choice. And the whole thing is about safety and planning the transport network properly so you don't have to get in your car. So it's just thinking about that holistic side of things. And it doesn't have to be about hard surfaces. It's about sort of soft surfaces that you can ride on and bridle ways, etc. So it's an integrated sort of holistic approach to village planning. That's it, really.
Thank you. So the next one, and my manager's going to thank me for this, Stephen, I'm going to throw this one to you. Why did the garden communities concept fail last time, and what is needed to address those failures?
Thank you, Luke. So if you want some detail on why the inspectors examining the previous local plan had serious concerns, and that is set out in their letter, which they sent to us on the 20th of January. It's up on Uttlesford District Council's website, and do have a read to have a go through that detail. But to summarise their concerns in a very high level, they were concerned about the deliverability of the garden communities. So they felt that the work hadn't been done to demonstrate the infrastructure required to support them, and they also thought that we had got the balance of delivery wrong by having too many homes in the garden communities and not enough in smaller and medium-sized sites in the existing settlements. We were putting off delivering housing to the end of the plan period, and we weren't facing the existing housing problem which Uttlesford has. So those are the two kind of high-level lessons which I take from their letter, but do have a read yourself.
Okay, thank you, Stephen. Okay, I'll read one out, but then I'll skip to the next. The next most popular one is from Jeff Gardner, and it asks, the local plan will need to allocate approximately 14,000 homes for a 20-year period. What proportion or number do you envisage for the rural villages? Sorry to disappoint you, Jeff, but there's no answer to that yet. So, you know, this is very much the first consultation. We're trying to get the message across that there is this government target for or minimum requirement that needs to be met for homes. It's quite a substantial scale of growth, and it's a real challenge, as has been thrown up in this discussion, for a rural district like Uttlesford to work out where that level of growth can be accommodated and how to balance that with other uses, and in particular things like employment and transport. So yeah, there's a lot of difficult questions to answer, but yeah, we're not going to be able to say right now what the proportion is that we see in the rural villages. So because I can't answer that one, move to the next one. It's probably the last one we've got time for. It's a bit of a long one, but the bit at the end in particular, I think, is something that might be interesting for Petra or Jennifer to address if they're able. So it's from Jeff Gardner again, and this one's, the circular pattern of village clusters shown in the slide is very diagrammatic. Actual villages in Uttlesford may not be like that. Even so, 2 miles between them is too far to walk, and cycling on country lanes, but with fast-moving traffic, would be only for the brave. Would this really work? And this is the sort of main bit. Even if new cycleways were to be created, how long would a network take to construct, and how would it be funded? I mean, yeah, I don't know if you can fully answer that question, but if there's anything you've considered there about how such a network, how that could be phased, how long it might take to construct, how the funding
I mean, in
would work.
terms of the funding, I think the answer was mentioned. Gear change provides that funding, and you are able to apply for it. So I think that's how long would it take? That is a question for, you know, contractors and detailed design and so on. But I think what would be interesting is to try also what Jennifer can maybe describe better, is that there's been trial cycle paths on the Blenheim Estate, which last summer were opened up for children to go to school, and it was temporary and it became permanent. and there was literally no change. It was just that before, those paths and bridleways were not open for people to cross or to use, and they simply opened them, and the uptake has been immediate of children cycling to schools across. It's been immediate. So I think, you know, something maybe for you to consider is when there was talk about getting data about some villages or clusters, and maybe something to consider is trialing these things and actually seeing for yourself whether there is appetite for it. And on Blenheim Estate, it's been really successful, and so those pathways which have been opened up for the school run have remained open, and it's a first step which was for free, really, because there were no construction works involved.
That's great, thanks Petra.
And a lot cheaper than building roads, I would say.
Great, well, I think that's probably all we've got time for on the Q&A. Lots of other really good questions. We'll take a look at those. As ever, the plea would be for those that have got questions and perhaps points underlying those questions that they really want to make us aware of when drafting the local plan. Please do submit your comments through the public consultation details on our website. And the big deadline now, everything all funnels in all the different themes. The deadline for comments is the 21st of April. So thank you all for your questions.
Thank you. I haven't got time for any more comments on this topic. If anyone's got any questions relating to the process. Frank, is your process question? Yes. Okay, go ahead.
Thank you very much. Very quick question. From looking at the comments that have been posted to the UDC consultation website, I can see very little diversity of the contributors. Based on their names purely, I reckon that virtually all of them are overwhelmingly white male. So what's UDC doing to actually include voices and opinions from a wider cross-section of the Uttlesford community? It's not your fault that people aren't responding, but maybe you're not accessing them correctly for them to be able to respond.
We have been discussing this. I'll let Luke answer, but I can assure you that this is something that has been troubling UDC. We've had lots of discussion about it, and before this process closes, there will be, I think, more activity to try and encourage more people to comment. But what I would say, I would just keep also encouraging panelists to remember that the comments that are taken into consideration are the ones on the website. So if you make a strong point here, you need to also go and make it on the website. And also, and everyone that leaves questions here also needs to go and make those comments on the website. So I just want to make that clear. But Luke, do you want to say a bit more about Frank's point?
Yeah, thanks, Frank, for, that is a really important point that you're raising there. Of course, we're trying to reach as wide a range of the community as possible. We want, to get to maximize the number of comments we're receiving. And yes, it has so far proven, I think, difficult. I mean, we don't have any data on exactly the sort of the personal data on the people making the comments. I appreciate you were just basing that on name, but yes, we haven't got many comments at the moment. So what we're doing, there's adverts and I think press releases being sent to papers. There's obviously all the information on websites, there's stuff on our social media channels. We'll also be, as Angela says, going into this kind of final push with, I think at times maybe the process has been a little complicated to follow with a series of different themes with different deadlines, but now it all becomes quite clear that the time for people to make their comments is now, and the big date that will be flagging up is the 21st of April. So hopefully the message becomes a bit clearer. And there'll be so links through to our webpage and social media channels. There'll be broadcast quite a lot by we'll be sending those out to parish councils and our district councils as well, using their networks to try and spread the word and get that moving. And then there's also actually something that we're just finalising, but we're sending out a youth survey. I think that's what we call it. It doesn't sound very good, or young person survey. So it kind of takes some of the key points from this consultation, using that as the source material, and trying to make it an engaging format for young people to be a bit more likely to make comments. So yeah, trying to do what we can. Obviously in normal times we'd also have in-person exhibitions and drop-in events and things. Of course we've not been able to do that. But yeah, hopefully we are relying to some extent on people spreading the word and getting those links sent around. But hopefully once people get to our website, it will be easy to follow. There'll be an update to the website in the morning as well that will kind of hopefully simplify the message for people.
Yes, and if anyone has any ideas, sort of ideas about sort of big exposure, then do please write to Luke and let him know. Because all ideas are welcome at the moment. And thank you, Alison, for your point about reposting, etc. Yes, everyone on the forum, anything you can do would be helpful. So thank you for that. I think we're going to the end of our topic for this evening, and therefore I'd just like to thank Petra and Jennifer. I think we may have lost Jennifer because we've gone well over our time on this subject. But Petra, please pass our thanks on to Jennifer as well. And thanks also to David for the great contributions this evening. Thank you very much to everybody for that. And if you would, we're going to carry on now, going back to some previous subjects. You're welcome to stay with us, but if you need to leave, then please do slip away. We do not mind. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was a great discussion, and yeah, it was really great to meet you all virtually, and thank you for the invitation. And I'll pass on the regards to Jennifer.
Thank you very much.
All right. Bye, everyone.
Okay, so just to reiterate, comments on this subject should be received on the website by the final consultation deadline of the 21st of April. So now we're moving on and moving back to responses to theme number 6 of biodiversity, and I believe Lois is going to take us through that. And we have a bit of a reduced amount of time on this now, so go, Lois.
I'll be very quick. Thank you. Good evening, everybody. I won't take too much time because we have overrun obviously a very interesting topic. We had many comments back from biodiversity, and they are on our website, so I'm not going to read them all out. I'm just going to pick up on 1 or 2 points which people made. I'm sorry, I'm looking at another screen here as opposed to yourselves, but I just want to read this out. We asked some questions about the use and management of land. And there were a lot of comments on pressure from public access into agricultural space, agricultural land, and not enough open space. So one of the comments to respond to that was around perhaps we should create at least one large park, so not little play parks, little play areas and that sort of thing. Obviously we need those as well, but if we need bigger areas to be able to sort of roam around as well. And we should also include extensive tree planting within the districts and sort of connecting between sites, obviously in those parks too. We should also be looking at areas which was a multifunctional area. So if you have a site which is the Sustainable Urban Drainage Scheme, you could use that for trees. It could be for amenity, it could have visual value. It could also be a sort of route, especially for biodiversity. So if you need to think about things, you know, in a sort of multi-purpose way rather than a single-purpose way, and encourage community initiatives by villages and parish councils to sort of green up the verges and villages and so on. And I will just quickly talk about, now one of the things that we have asked is how can you actually do this in the planning process? Now the obvious thing for us to do is to look at local plan designation. So that would be actual policies themselves to protect and enhance areas, but also to designate these new routes in networks and connectivity between sites, and also a park or a large area or two. So we need to look at that. We suggested that we should really focus on proper biodiversity action plans, and this could be at a local level, like the parish level, as well as across the district. So, and that would take things very much down to the local level and involve local people and engagement as well, which would go down well. And we should also be asking absolutely developers to include themselves biodiversity action plans, and to make sure that through the planning process that these are implemented and enforced, and obviously, and then the land is managed properly for biodiversity after that. I think those are the main things. The only other thing is about land management and working with farmers and other large landowners to manage land from a biodiversity point of view as much as from sort of an economic point of view as well. So I mean, there's a whole host of other comments that were made, but I think those are the main points.
Thanks very much, Lois. Would anybody like to comment on the feedback that Lois has given and the documents that we've had on biodiversity? Edward.
Surprise, surprise. Yeah, a few things. Firstly, it mentions water, but I think water availability needs to be part of it, not just worrying about the flooding and so on, but the availability before development happens, to check that we can supply it without depleting our aquifer too much. I'm wondering whether you mentioned a biodiversity net gain metric calculator, and I did ask a question about that and didn't get a clear answer, but I was wondering whether that also includes the invertebrates in soil, the quality of the soil, and you know, the back goes as far as down as the bacteria that we actually depend on. So right at the bottom of the food chain, whether that is part of your net gain metric calculator. I would love to see something in the local plan that topsoil can only be removed under license. I would love to see the amenity value of trees calculated so that it wasn't just their visual impact, but it was including their carbon sequestration and their biodiversity capability, what they're hosting. Under wildflowers, it kind of mentions verges, but that really needs to include all public land, museum, you know, outside the museum here or the castle here, and cemeteries. And on solar farms, there was a phrase saying not just to reduce carbon emissions, but I think we need to have a policy that requires them to maximize carbon sequestration. So it's not a reduction, it's a maximization of sequestration with soil tested before and afterwards. So if it's decent soil, you don't stick a solar farm there. Thank you.
Thank you. Richard, did you have your hand up?
It was only just to emphasise the point about using parish councils as a resource. I mean, I do think that every village will have its wildlife enthusiasts, and I think that they would actually love to do biodiversity audits, whatever it might be. And I would suggest that it's an initiative that could be put in hand pretty quickly. And I just think taking that down to a local level, you will get genuine local knowledge, and also you will build up some enthusiasm. It's something that people can contribute individually to the local plan.
Thank you. That's a brilliant. I'm going to send my children into the garden over the Easter holidays to count ladybirds. That should use up a day.
That's excellent. I saw a few today.
Anybody else like to take Samantha?
Yes, I wondered if we can also make a mention of water companies and their responsibility to not pollute. I can't see a mention of that. So if UDC could have some sort of engagement with them, because I do understand the CAM is polluted by the water companies as well as by agriculture, and to try to find ways to not do that anymore would be great. Last time, I think it was, that we heard about solar community interest companies. So to cross-reference that in this document, because that seemed like a brilliant idea, where village halls and different churches joined together to make this electricity, sustainable electricity from solar panels, in a way that doesn't impinge on the countryside and ruin our green assets. So perhaps cross-reference that and see if that can be something that could be done as well. Thanks.
Thank you. Anybody else on biodiversity? No? Okay, good. Thank you very much, everybody. And thank you, Lois, for taking us through that. We're going back further now. Believe it or not, we've come back to transport. So, perfect. Stephen, if you can find something more to say on transport, go ahead.
Thank you, Angela. Yes, so I was just going to summarise the discussion at Local Plan Leadership Group last night, which considered the representations received so far on transport, as well as your own discussion. previously. The discussion last night, I'll just pick out a few kind of high-level points. It talked about on-demand minibuses being a way to potentially help deliver buses in a rural area where they may not otherwise be viable. There was a discussion, actually pertinently, on how cycleways can link rural communities. And then also some discussion of the role of the county council in providing transport infrastructure. I actually made the point during this discussion that the county would find it easier to provide transport infrastructure in the district if we had a local plan setting out where development was, so that it could be planned alongside infrastructure. And then there was also a discussion in kind of out-of-the-box thinking around driverless pods and other sort of ideas looking into the future. Again, recognising that buses may be bus networks in the district are currently problematic and may continue to be problematic, but there may be other ways of looking at it. And then one of the key points towards the end was seeking to draw out the principles or draw out a potential principle from the representations. And this was about the location or locating homes and jobs close to each other where we can, so as to help reduce the need for transport. And I think that's my high-level summary of yesterday's discussion.
Thanks very much, Stephen. Believe it or not, people, we've come to the end of all the themes. Well done. Thank you very much for so much discussion. Thank you all for behaving so incredibly well and you've got so good at being so concise. We're always on time. Brilliant. Thank you. So probably what we can do now, I think, is reduce the frequency of these meetings, because obviously what we're mainly doing now is the last 2 points where we go back and review what's happening with past themes. So I think there's going to be a new meeting schedule circulated and publicised in due course. And at the next meeting, we're also going to discuss the role of the forum beyond this current consultation. Luke, is there any more that you want to say about that?
That's about the size of it, to be honest. But yeah, I'd just love to echo that that sentiment. Thank you all so much. Meeting every 2 weeks is quite a commitment, and most of you have managed it every time. So it's been really helpful, and it's such insightful discussion that we've benefited from. But yeah, we think we can ease the burden for you a little bit now that we've reached the end of the new themes. The focus is now on the whole community getting in their comments by the 21st of April. And then, as Angela says, the next meetings will circulate an updated schedule in due course. But the next meeting will be focusing just on feedback for previous themes, so your chance to have make some comments on those. But then also it would be useful to then, if you can perhaps before then reflect a little bit on how you think this process has been and what you think has worked well, what could be improved, because then we'll be able to have a little bit of discussion as to what our thoughts are as to what the role of the forum could be moving forwards. So it's unlikely to be as intensive as this, because this has all been connected to a formal consultation, but we think that there will be real value in having the forum involved while we are preparing some of the policies for the draft plan. So that's just, you'll hear more soon on exact dates, but again, thank you for your commitment so far.
Thanks very much, Luke. So is there any other business before we conclude this evening? No, well, thank you again. I just echo my previous sentiment for the other week that it would be very nice to see you all in person at some point. But thank you all very much for the time that you've put into this, and we will see you at the next meeting when Luke has scheduled.